Hello, and thank you so much for having me join your meeting today. I am very grateful to be attending virtually and appreciate this opportunity to share issues that relate to human milk. The title of my talk, Strengthening Systems to Ensure Equitable Access to Life-Saving Human Milk, and really talking with you around the ethical challenges and what are these implications when it comes to sharing, selling, and donating human milk. But I think to even begin our discussion today, we have to set the context because this all relates to neonatal health. And really, we need to pause and consider where in the world are most neonates dying today? Where is the greatest burden? And I appreciate this map because it inflates and very visually presents that 98% of neonatal deaths occur in low middle income countries. 75% of these occur in Southern Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, as is so visual here. Thinking about the numbers, it is staggering. The prevalence of small and sick newborns globally, 15 million newborns are born preterm, born early every year. 20.5 million newborns are low birth weight. 30 million newborns remain hospitalized for one reason or another. Beyond what is considered normal for postpartum care. Because of these numbers, newborn mortality continues to be a massive global threat, and the low middle income countries bear the burden here. It is these numbers that drive the under 5 child mortality rates around the world. We've seen lower gains in how we've improved infant mortality globally, despite the fact that we have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 3.2, which is to end preventable newborn deaths and reduce neonatal mortality. This is still a massive, massive problem, and innovative solutions are really being sought. One of the solutions that has long been understood for infant health, for child health, is human milk. It is irrefuted that due to its numerous benefits, human milk is considered to be a pivotal strategy for saving lives of infants. And this relates as well to those infants who are most vulnerable, the ones we just discussed, preterm, low birth weight, sick, otherwise remaining hospitalized. In documents like this from the World Health Organization that really outline steps for care for these small and sick newborns, when it comes to nutrition, what is recommended is breast milk. It is the biological norm and the best nutrition, the first nutritional choice for these infants. However, it's not that simple because women in these situations, the low middle income settings that bear this burden, women are giving birth in all different kinds of conditions with different levels of neonatal care and focus on that baby and mom, different environments for breastfeeding, often with no to little support, and many, many other competing priorities. However, no matter what, and no matter what conditions these babies are born into, they have a right, a basic human right, to receive optimal nutrition, and that is mother's milk. The question is how. So for us, and really the foundation for all of the work that my team is involved in, it is really about equity for achieving this optimal nutrition for those babies who are most vulnerable, especially this type of category, those babies who don't have access to their own mother's milk. And often that is the case because in these hospital settings, the mother and baby are separated. Perhaps the mother has had surgery or is ill. Perhaps the baby was abandoned or orphaned. What happens then? We know that mother's milk is the optimal choice. How do we ensure that even in these challenging situations, these babies can receive human milk? We know that this is a very, very common and real problem around the world, developed countries and developing countries the same. Roughly up to 40% of vulnerable neonates in a neonate intensive care unit will be lacking mother's own milk for either the first hours, days, or weeks of life. So it is a very real issue that needs addressing. However, the WHO has standards for these infants, that these critical infants who are low birth weight, preterm, no matter where they are, these babies should receive mother's own milk as the first preference. But when mother's own milk cannot be fed, not available, then the best option, the second option for them is donor human milk. And that should be provided where there are safe and affordable milk banking facilities in place. So what is a human milk bank? I think many of you are familiar with processing along a number of different types of substances and tissues and things. And a human milk bank is very similar. It's a service that provides a standardized process for recruitment of donors, collecting the milk in a standardized way, expressing or collection in some standardized way, controlling the temperature. Typically pasteurization is used, although not always, to inactivate the pathogens that would be in the milk. Bacterial screening, often pre and post pasteurization. Temperature controlled, again, as it awaits allocation to the infants who meet specific criteria. These processes vary around the world, and sometimes they vary even within a country. There's a couple images from a few of the milk banks around the world. In Australia, for example, and it's not the only location that is linked actually with the blood service in Australia, together with the Red Cross, because of the alignment often around focus on safety and labeling, storage, things like that. However, often we have arranged centralized milk banks that provide milk to a region and through transport, or decentralized, where there are a number of smaller milk banks throughout a country. However, this is a very inequitable situation. Roughly, currently, there are around 700 milk banks that exist in the world. If you look at this map, over 200 of those are in one country, Brazil, because beginning in the 1980s, they began to prioritize provision of human milk, breastfeeding support, and implementation of human milk banks as a nationalized strategy around the country. But elsewhere, you'll see that the majority of these milk banks are in the European countries, in North America, and some scattered throughout China and India. However, we know with the massive burden that India faces and South Asia, as well as the African continent, this is massive inequity. It's just absolutely not adequate. We need a large scale up of milk banks to meet the demand. One of the major challenges that has impaired scale up is that there has not been global guidelines available to provide some kind of minimum standard as countries are seeking to establish a milk bank. What are the minimum standards that they should follow related to safety, ethics, clinical use? That has not existed. So every country has been left on their own to determine these systems as they see fit, which is a daunting task. Thankfully, what is currently happening is that the WHO is in the process of developing these global guidelines. After years and years of advocacy that this is needed, we hope that these guidelines will be available within the next 2 years. However, currently, there are a number of ethical dilemmas that face human milk banks and the neonatal fields that typically monitor them. One that really drives so many of the other questions that I'll propose here following is that there's a gap in how we classify, regulate, and even the terminology we use for human milk. There is no legal framework that protects human milk. Donor human milk resides within a few existing frameworks. The Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, that is meant to protect breastfeeding. Human milk is also considered a medical product of human origin, together with tissues, cells, organs, blood. Or is it a first food? Is it nutrition? Many countries are adamant that this is not a tissue, it's a food. Or is it an essential medicine? Countries grapple with this, and this has significant implications for then how they develop their operating procedures. But ultimately, who's responsible for monitoring all of this? Is it at the global or regional policy level? Is it the hospital, the doctor, or is it the mother herself, whether you're the donor or the recipient of that donor human milk? None of these things have been answered to date. Another very real issue that's facing the field globally is the informal milk sharing. Mothers help mothers, and it's a beautiful thing. It's happened since the beginning of time. Many mothers don't meet official criteria for donor human milk from a milk bank. There's a supply and demand challenge there. Typically, human milk banks provide donor human milk to those most critical. What about all of the other mothers who need assistance? Mothers who aren't able to breastfeed, adopted infants. Is this empowering women, or does it undermine safety? There are risks associated with informal milk sharing. And ultimately, what does it do for supporting breastfeeding? We know, particularly in the country I'm from, that's a massive challenge. Do we provide a solid foundation for mothers so that they can adequately breastfeed? And all of these things have to be considered so that you're not just putting a Band-Aid on a much larger problem. There's also the informal buying and selling of human milk, not only just sharing. And often these terms are used interchangeably, but they are different. Should human milk actually be bought and sold, even in an informal setting? If so, what protections are in place for the donor, for the recipient? What about that baby? And these are a few examples of some of the, excuse me, some of the organizations and companies or informal mechanisms that advertise this. And this has gotten quite a bit of media attention over time. Taking this to another level is actually the commercializing of human milk as a commodity. Is corporate profit for human milk ethical? Here are a number of companies that have been involved in this over time. Some in the United States, some in Australia, India, and in other countries. This is a growing problem and one of great concern. Some might argue, is this needed for sustainability? You need to have some kind of profit in order to drive a field. However, we're talking about a human substance, and what transparencies and protections are in place for the donor, for the recipient, and for the baby. Again, thinking that there is no guidelines that are protecting this system currently. An example of this recently, several years ago, was in Cambodia. A for-profit company based in the United States was purchasing milk from very vulnerable mothers in Cambodia and shipping it back to the United States for processing and sale. And UNICEF thankfully stepped in, I think informed the government of these risks and was able to close down this company. This was of great concern because obviously they were targeting a very vulnerable population in Cambodia. Another issue that is a continuing issue, again, thinking about this entire field is in the context of infant feeding. What about the role of donor human milk in supporting versus undermining breastfeeding? Donor human milk is ultimately to be used only as a bridge, only to be used until mother's own milk is available. That goal is to ensure that that baby is breastfeeding, especially by the time they are discharged from the hospital. However, what we see so often is that it is easier to pull donor human milk off the shelf than it is to provide specialized lactation support to a mother of a preterm infant, for example. So what we often see is overuse or misuse of donor human milk. When it's used for non-critical replacement for mom's own milk, and when it's used actually as an alternative to breastfeeding, instead of to be used as an alternative to formula, which is its ultimate purpose. Again, who is regulating this and who is stepping in to ensure that this does not happen? In the United States, especially, one thing that we are seeing is that provision of donor human milk follows racial and socioeconomic lines. There's been numerous studies and quite a bit of media attention mapping the hospitals that have access to donor human milk and why. And it absolutely leaves those babies most vulnerable, following a racial divide without access to donor human milk. It's an unequitable situation. So several years ago, a group of us got together to try to begin discussing these questions. Representatives from around the world representing human milk banking, neonatology, human rights, tissue banking, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and we met together with the Assoc Center, which is a bioethics team at Oxford University. Apologies. To really think about these ethical dilemmas. For the first time, a group had never been brought together to try to determine how do we approach these many ethical questions, given there are no global guidelines yet. How do we begin to construct some type of guidance for countries who are grappling with all of these issues? And one of the things that we really started thinking about was, how do you actually determine the value of human milk? What constitutes that value? And one of the leaders, the thought leaders who's been driving this for many years is actually from Perth, one of your very own, Ben Hartman, who was in this field for many, many years. And he helped us really to drive forward the thinking that this is a multiple prong issue. We have to consider, when we're thinking about moral agents across this donation, sharing, selling, that you have a donor, you've got a breastfeeding mom, you have a recipient, that baby, and the recipient mom. There's a third party in there somewhere. Is that the hospital? Is that the milk bank? You've got the peer-to-peer sharing, all these other issues, but whatever we do to address ethics, we have to consider all of these factors, including the product, the milk product itself. So at this meeting also, the World Health Organization presented, okay, let's think about the medical products of human origin, the MPHO system, and think about that as what about if we use their common framework? How do we begin to use their principles to drive forward ethical decision-making around donor human milk? So these are the principles that were discussed and tried to align them with how we think about donor human milk. I'm just going to present a few very briefly, but principle 5, really thinking about donors, justice, non-maleficence, that these donors shouldn't benefit, nor should they lose financially. Financial incentives are ethically problematic. You've got the risk of coercion and a number of other things. And principle 6, that donors should be protected against physical or psychological risks. What about the risk of diverting milk from the mother's own infant? You have a donor who wants to donate milk. What if she donates too much because she gets paid and her own baby suffers? And that must be considered. What about the recipients from a beneficence perspective, that this is really to be used only when there's clinical utility? Donor human milk is preferred to formula. What happens though if a mother is able to breastfeed, but she chooses not to? Who decides what's appropriate in those situations? Thinking about donors and recipients together, autonomy, beneficence, and justice, that the product should be disclosed without compromising confidentiality. This becomes an issue in some situations because of cultural concerns around kinship that's related to milk. A donor, a baby receiving donor human milk could be considered a milk sibling in some settings. And so they need to have tracking ability to know who the donor was. And so this complicates things, but there can't be one set standard here. We might prefer in some settings that this be anonymous and in others not. Principle 8, that really how we allocate milk should be based on clinical criteria and ethical norms. But there is no clear guidance. Hospitals develop this criteria, so it varies. And also insurance. In some settings, parents have to pay for this milk. In other settings, insurance covers, or the hospitals. But this certainly is unequitable. Thinking about the product itself and non-maleficence, this milk needs to be of the highest quality. It needs to be traceable. It needs to be safe. As we presented earlier, though, across the globe, there's quite a range in how milk is processed, and there is no standard really to enforce how this is done. Thinking about the system itself, where donor human milk sits, where it's processed, where it's provided, what's the justice in the legal framework? Who's responsible? According to this principle, governments are responsible for this. However, right now there is little regulation of either nonprofit or for-profit milk banks. Governments really have not stepped in like they should. And so, you know, there were many things discussed in this meeting, and the output was published in the Lancet Global Health with really a call to action for countries and global policy leaders that, look, we need to address this issue. This is a problem. And so some of the considerations that have to be included, whether we're talking about global policy, global guidelines, or countries, as they're developing their own guidelines, they have to consider these things. Aside from just the safety and the processing, these ethical considerations around the vulnerability of both donor and recipient have to be included. The equity and fairness, who gets this milk, who receives this milk, how is it allocated, and how do we prevent exploitation of those donor mothers? Autonomy, how do we do this and ensure that confidentiality is in place, but we really do allow for flexibility for cultural issues that might come into play around religion and kinship. Human rights, the way to really frame all of this is that, look, governments need to be called on to meet their commitments to women and children, thinking about this from a human rights standpoint. It's the right of women and children to adequate food, nutrition, health, and informed choice. And framing it that way, I think, really grounds this whole discussion. So we close that call to action with recommended actions for governments that we ensure, as guidelines and legislation are developed, that these ethical principles are included and considered as critical components of those guidelines to help guide all decision-making in a country and a region. Action 2, that developing some kind of guidance for donor milk is needed at a global level. It is absolutely imperative. And action 3, that then regional and national levels, governments get involved. They must bear some responsibility here to protect this milk and to protect all of those involved. And then action 4, there are many biomedical and social science research gaps that require further investigation and exploration to continue helping us to improve this field. So I do want to close by saying that some of this was heard. As I mentioned previously, the World Health Organization did acknowledge and heard action number 2. And so they are in the midst now of developing global guidelines for human milk banking. And components of that will include some of these ethical principles. But obviously there is much to do. So with that, I will close, and I hope you reach out with any questions or comments. And it has been a pleasure to be a part of this today. Thank you so much.